In suburban Chicago, a 58-year-old hospital administrator was about to cross a line she never imagined crossing. What started as a routine evening at Mercy General took a shocking turn when she came face to face with her daughter's medical records. Margaret Castellano wasn't your typical patient services director. For 15 years, she had spent her life navigating the complex world of healthcare administration, known for her unwavering ethical standards and fierce advocacy for families in crisis. When she encountered her son-in-law's systematic campaign to isolate her daughter, she had no idea she was walking into a web of psychological manipulation that would force her to choose between her career and her family. Margaret accessed confidential files that would lead to the discovery of fabricated incidents and falsified documentation, painting her as an unstable threat to her own grandchild. What began as a desperate mother's search for answers would become a dangerous game of truth versus deception. The quiet suburban neighborhood would never be the same after a grandmother's love collided with a manipulator's control, forcing a pregnant woman to choose between the husband who claimed to protect her and the mother who actually did. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Castellano was reviewing patient discharge summaries when her phone rang. The familiar number made her smile, or it would have 6 months ago. Now, seeing David's name on the display sent a familiar knot of tension through her shoulders. "Hello, David." She kept her voice neutral, professional. The same tone she used with difficult family members in the hospital corridors. "Margaret." His voice was crisp, businesslike, not the warm greeting of a son-in-law calling his wife's mother. "I need to talk to you about this weekend. The baby shower." Margaret had been looking forward to it for weeks, had already wrapped the handmade baby blanket she'd been working on for months. The soft yellow yarn had been chosen carefully, gender neutral, since Emma wanted to be surprised. Margaret had imagined herself helping set up, arranging flowers, watching Emma open gifts with that radiant smile she'd had since childhood. "What about it?" Margaret asked, though something in David's tone already made her stomach clench. "Emma and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if you didn't come." The words hit her like a physical blow. Margaret's pen slipped from her fingers, clattering onto her desk. Around her, the familiar sounds of Mercy General's administrative wing, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, the distant hum of conversations, seemed to fade into white noise. "I'm sorry, what?" "Look, Margaret, I know this is difficult, but Emma's been feeling overwhelmed lately. The pregnancy, all the preparations. She needs space right now, from family pressures." Family pressures. The phrase felt like a slap. Margaret had done nothing but support Emma through every moment of this pregnancy she'd been allowed to witness. The monthly lunch dates that had somehow become every other month, then sporadic. The shopping trips for baby items that Emma had stopped inviting her to. The doctor's appointments Margaret had offered to attend, only to be told they were handling in. "David, I helped plan this shower. I paid for the flowers, the cake. And we appreciate that, really. But Emma specifically asked me to call you. She didn't want to upset you herself, given her condition." Given her condition. As if pregnancy had rendered Emma incapable of making a simple phone call to her own mother. Margaret had carried Emma through 42 hours of labor, had raised her alone after Richard's death, had been there for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every triumph. And now she was being dismissed like an inconvenient acquaintance. "I want to talk to Emma." "She's resting. Doctor's orders. You understand how important it is that she avoid stress right now." The implication was clear. Margaret was stress. Margaret, who had held Emma's hair while she battled morning sickness during those early weeks. Margaret, who had driven 3 hours to help them move into their new house. Margaret, who had bit her tongue a dozen times when David's controlling tendencies showed themselves because Emma seemed happy. "This is ridiculous, David. Emma wouldn't..." Margaret. His voice carried a warning now, the false politeness cracking. I know you mean well, but you have to understand that Emma and I are a family now. We need to make decisions that are best for our family without outside interference. Outside interference. 28 years of motherhood reduced to interference. She's my daughter. She's my wife, and the mother of my child. I think I know what's best for her right now. The line went dead. Margaret stared at her phone, disbelief washing over her in waves. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. She scrolled to Emma's number with shaking fingers, pressed call, and listened to her daughter's voicemail greeting. Bright, happy, recorded months ago when everything was still normal. Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom. David just called, and I think there's been some confusion about the shower. Can you call me back? I love you. Her voice cracked on the last words. Margaret tried to return to her paperwork, but the words blurred together. She kept glancing at her phone, willing it to ring. When it finally did, an hour later, it wasn't Emma. It was her own mother. Margaret, you sound terrible. What's wrong? Janet Castellano had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense family trouble from 50 miles away. At 82, her instincts were as sharp as ever. It's nothing, Ma, just work stress. Don't lie to me. I didn't raise you to be a liar, and I'm too old for it now. What happened? Margaret closed her office door and sank into her chair. David called. He uninvited me from Emma's baby shower. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. That snake, Janet finally said, her voice carrying the steel that had helped her survive immigration, widowhood, and raising a daughter alone during the Depression. I knew there was something wrong with that boy the first time I met him. Don't ma me. I've been watching this happen for months. The way he hovers around Emma. The way he speaks for her. And now this. Janet's voice grew sharper. When's the last time you talked to Emma alone? Really alone? Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. When was the last time? Their lunch dates always seemed to be interrupted by David's calls. Their shopping trips had stopped altogether. Even their phone conversations felt stilted lately, as if Emma was reading from a script. He's isolating her, Janet continued. My grandmother used to tell stories about men like this back in the old country. Smooth talkers who slowly cut their wives off from everyone who loved them. You're being dramatic. David loves Emma. Does he? Or does he love controlling her? The question hung in the air like smoke. Margaret thought about David's behavior at family gatherings, the way he answered questions directed at Emma, the subtle corrections he made to her stories. She'd attributed it to his protective nature, his desire to take care of his pregnant wife. But now, replaying those moments through her mother's sharp observation, they felt different, darker. I need to see her, Margaret said suddenly. Be careful, Cara Mia. Men like this, they don't give up control easily. After ending the call, Margaret sat in her office as afternoon faded to evening. She tried Emma's number 3 more times, each call going straight to voicemail. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. She gathered her things and headed for her car. The drive to Emma's house took 20 minutes through suburban Chicago traffic. Margaret had made this trip countless times over the past year, bringing casseroles, during Emma's morning sickness phase, helping with household projects, just spending time with her daughter. The house, a modest colonial in a quiet neighborhood, had always felt welcoming. Now, as Margaret pulled up across the street, it felt like enemy territory. A delivery truck was parked in the driveway. 2 men were unloading what looked like baby shower decorations, pastel balloons, floral arrangements, a banner reading, Welcome Baby Ross. Margaret's chest tightened. She'd helped choose those decorations, had spent hours on Pinterest with Emma looking at shower themes. Through the living room window, she could see figures moving around. Emma's distinctive silhouette was unmistakable, even at 7 months pregnant. She was arranging something on a table, her movements animated as she talked to someone out of view. She didn't look like someone who needed to avoid stress. She looked happy, engaged, excited about her upcoming shower. A shower her mother wasn't invited to. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel as the full weight of her exclusion settled over her. This wasn't about Emma's health or stress levels. This was deliberate, calculated. As she watched her daughter prepare for a celebration that would happen without her, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate. But underneath it, something harder was taking root. Her mother was right. This wasn't normal. This wasn't love. This was control. And Margaret Castellano had spent too many years fighting for her family to give up now. Margaret drove home through the darkening streets, her mind spinning with fragments of conversations, canceled plans, and half-remembered moments that suddenly felt significant. She pulled into her driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, watching the lights in her neighbors' windows. Families settling in for ordinary evenings, probably unaware of how precious that ordinariness was. Inside her house, Margaret poured herself a glass of wine she didn't want and opened her laptop. If David was systematically isolating Emma, there would be evidence. Margaret had spent 15 years in patient services, tracking patterns in medical records, identifying inconsistencies in family histories. She knew how to build a case from scattered details. She opened a new document and titled it, Timeline. The cursor blinked at her, waiting. January 15th. Emma calls to announce pregnancy. Excited, wants me to be first to know after David. Margaret remembered that call clearly. Emma's voice had been breathless with joy, slightly conspiratorial as she shared the secret. They'd talked for over an hour about due dates, nursery themes, whether morning sickness really meant a healthy pregnancy. It had felt like the old days when Emma would call her from college just to talk. January 28th, planned lunch to discuss pregnancy, canceled by David. Emma, not feeling well. February 10th, first prenatal appointment. Emma mentions it afterward, says, David took such good care of me. Margaret paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She'd offered to go to that appointment, had specifically asked Emma if she wanted company, knowing how nervous first appointments could be. Emma had laughed it off, said David was being such a protective husband about coming with her. When had Emma stopped asking Margaret for support and started accepting David's protection instead? February 18th. Planned shopping trip for maternity clothes canceled last minute. David says Emma overdid it at work. March 5th. Emma's birthday dinner. David orders for her, says she's been having food aversions. The pattern became clearer as Margaret scrolled through her phone, checking text message threads that now read like a catalog of subtle rejections. Her messages to Emma, photos of baby clothes she'd seen, articles about pregnancy, simple thinking of you texts, often went unanswered for days. When Emma did respond, her replies were brief, almost formal. Thanks, Mom. David and I will think about it. I appreciate the advice, but David found a great book already. David thinks it's better if I rest this weekend instead. David. When had her independent, spirited daughter started filtering every decision through her husband? Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from her neighbor across the street, Helen Martinez. Saw Emma at the grocery store yesterday. She looked tired but beautiful. Baby bump is getting so big. Was surprised she was shopping alone, though. Thought that husband of hers barely let her out of his sight these days. Margaret stared at the message. Emma had been at the grocery store yesterday. Alone. Just 2 blocks from Margaret's house, and she hadn't called, hadn't stopped by. 6 months ago, Emma would have texted Margaret from the cereal aisle, asking if she needed anything picked up. She scrolled further back in her text history, looking for the last time Emma had initiated contact. Really initiated it, not just responded to something Margaret had sent. She had to go back 4 months. 4 months since her daughter had reached out to her spontaneously. 4 months of Margaret being the one to call, to text, to suggest meetings that were increasingly difficult to arrange. Margaret closed her laptop and walked to the kitchen, where a small bulletin board held family photos and reminders. There, pinned next to her grocery list, was the ultrasound photo Emma had given her at their last lunch date. Margaret remembered how Emma had pulled it from her purse with a shy smile, how they'd marveled together at the tiny profile, the perfect little nose. David took so many pictures of the screen with his phone, Emma had said. He wants to document everything. At the time, Margaret had found it sweet. Now she wondered if David's documentation served a different purpose. Control. Ownership. Making sure he was the primary keeper of their baby's first images. Margaret's phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Dr. Sarah Chen's name appeared on the screen. Sarah? Working late again? Could ask you the same thing. I just finished with a difficult delivery and saw your office light was still on earlier. Everything okay? You seemed distracted during rounds today. Margaret had worked with Sarah for 5 years, had watched her navigate her own pregnancies, while maintaining her demanding career as an obstetrician. Sarah had a gift for reading people, for sensing when something was wrong beneath the surface. Family stuff, Margaret said carefully. Nothing I can't handle. Family stuff often involves the most complex ethical considerations, Sarah said, her voice gentle but probing. Sometimes our professional training helps us see patterns we might miss in our personal lives. But sometimes it also makes us second-guess our instincts. Margaret felt a chill. What do you mean? I mean that understanding family systems and recognizing unhealthy dynamics is part of what we do. But when it's our own family... Sarah paused. Margaret, if someone you cared about was being isolated from their support system, what would you advise them to do? The question hung in the air. Margaret could picture Sarah in her office, probably still in scrubs, her expression thoughtful and concerned. I'd tell them to trust their instincts, Margaret said slowly, and to document everything. Build a case based on facts, not emotions. Good advice. And if that person had professional access to information that might help them understand the full scope of the situation? Margaret's breath caught. Sarah, I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate, just reminding you that there are boundaries. We maintain for good reasons. Professional ethics exist to protect everyone involved, including us. Sometimes the hardest part of caring for people is knowing when we're too close to maintain objectivity. After Sarah hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen staring at Emma's ultrasound photo. Professional boundaries, ethical considerations. The words echoed in her mind as she thought about all the information that flowed through her department at Mercy General. Birth plans, medical histories, emergency contacts, information that might tell her exactly how far David's control extended. Margaret walked to her home office and opened her laptop again. She pulled up the hospital's employee portal, her login credentials appearing automatically in the fields. Her finger hovered over the mouse button. This was dangerous territory. Everything Sarah had said about professional boundaries was true. But those boundaries assumed normal family situations, healthy relationships, mutual respect. They didn't account for daughters who disappeared behind walls of manipulation. They didn't account for mothers who watched their children become strangers. Margaret closed the laptop without logging in, but the temptation remained, pulsing beneath. Her thoughts like a second heartbeat. She had the access. She had the justification, at least in her own mind. And she had the growing certainty that Emma needed protecting, even if she didn't know it yet. The question was whether Margaret was strong enough to cross lines she'd never crossed before. Whether love could justify breaking the rules that had governed her professional life for 15 years. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Margaret's resolve crystallized into something hard and unforgiving. David Ross thought he could manipulate her daughter, isolate her from her mother, rewrite their family history to suit his needs. He was about to learn that Margaret Castellano didn't surrender without a fight. Even if that fight took her into territory she'd never dared enter before. 3 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and distracted workdays. Margaret moved through her responsibilities at Mercy General like a ghost, reviewing discharge, summaries, and coordinating patient services while her mind churned with questions she couldn't answer. Every time her phone buzzed, she hoped it would be Emma. It never was. The baby shower had happened without her. Margaret knew because Janet had driven by Emma's house and reported back with military precision. 15 cars in the driveway. Pink balloons on the mailbox. Guess they found out it's a girl. That snake David was playing the perfect host on the front porch. A granddaughter. Margaret was going to have a granddaughter, and she'd learned about it from her 82-year-old mother conducting reconnaissance missions. Thursday evening found Margaret alone in her office after hours, the administrative wing of the hospital quiet, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the night shift. She'd volunteered to finish the quarterly patient, satisfaction reports, anything to avoid going home to her empty house and the thoughts that followed her there. But the thoughts found her anyway. She stared at her computer screen, where the hospital's patient management system login page waited. Her fingers traced the edge of her keyboard as she thought about Sarah's words. Professional ethics exist to protect everyone involved, including us. But what about when the system failed? What about when professional boundaries became barriers that prevented her from protecting her own daughter? Margaret had been asking herself the same questions for 3 days. Each time, the answers led her back to this moment, this choice, this line she'd never imagined herself capable of crossing. She typed in her username and password. The system opened with its familiar interface: patient records, administrative tools, reporting functions. Margaret had navigated these screens thousands of times over the past 15 years. They were as familiar as her own reflection. But tonight, they felt foreign, dangerous. She clicked on the patient search function and hesitated. Once she typed Emma's name, there would be a digital trail. System logs tracked every access, every file opened, every screen viewed. Marcus Thompson reviewed those logs monthly as part of routine security audits. But Margaret also knew the logs were vast, encompassing thousands of patient interactions across multiple departments. One search among thousands might not stand out, might not be noticed, might not destroy her career. Her hands trembled as she typed, Ross, Emma Castellano. The search returned one result. Emma's patient file appeared on the screen with her photograph, the same radiant smile Margaret remembered from childhood, though the picture was recent enough to show the glow of early pregnancy. Patient ID number, birth date, insurance information. All the clinical details that reduced her vibrant, complicated daughter to data points in a medical database. Margaret clicked on the obstetrics tab, her heart hammering against her ribs. Emma's prenatal care history unfolded before her. Regular appointments, normal test results. No complications noted. Dr. Patricia Williams as the attending physician, Margaret knew Pat, respected her clinical judgment and bedside manner. Everything looked routine until Margaret reached the birth plan section. The document was detailed, professionally formatted, clearly the result of extensive discussion between Emma, David, and Dr. Williams. Margaret scanned the medical. Preferences: natural birth if possible, epidural available if needed, delayed cord clamping, skin-to-skin contact immediately after delivery. All normal choices for a healthy pregnancy. But then she reached the section labeled Visitor Restrictions and Family Considerations. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Patient requests limited visitor access during labor and delivery. Only spouse, David Ross, permitted in delivery room. Patient has specifically requested that mother, Margaret Castellano, not be contacted during labor and not be permitted hospital access during delivery or immediate postpartum period. The words blurred as Margaret read them again, certain she'd misunderstood. But there they were, stark and undeniable in the medical record. Her own name, flagged for exclusion from the most important moment of her daughter's life. But worse was what came next. Patient reports ongoing family stress related to mother's boundary violations and inappropriate interference in pregnancy decisions. Multiple incidents documented of unwanted contact and pressure regarding medical choices. Patient and spouse request staff awareness of potential disruptive behavior from maternal family member. Margaret's hand shook as she scrolled down to find the documented incidents referenced in the note. Incident 1, March 15th. Patient reports mother arrived at prenatal appointment uninvited, became argumentative with medical staff when asked to leave consultation room. Margaret stared at the screen in disbelief. March 15th. She'd been working a double shift at the hospital that day, hadn't even known Emma had an appointment. She'd never set foot in Dr. Williams' office uninvited. Incident 2, April 3rd. Patient. Reports mother called multiple times demanding information about prenatal test results. Became verbally abusive when patient declined to share private medical information. April 3rd was Emma's birthday. Margaret had called to wish her happy birthday and ask how her routine checkup had gone. Emma had seemed distant, distracted, but Margaret had attributed it to pregnancy fatigue. The conversation had lasted maybe 5 minutes. Incident 3, April 20th. Patient reports mother showed up at family home unannounced, refused to leave when asked, caused significant emotional distress requiring patient to seek medical evaluation for pregnancy-related anxiety. This one made Margaret's vision blur with rage. April 20th had been their planned lunch date, confirmed via text message the night before. Margaret had arrived at Emma's house to pick her up and found her daughter in tears, claiming she'd forgotten about their plans and wasn't feeling well. David had appeared at the door, explaining gently that Emma was having a difficult day and needed rest. Margaret had left immediately, worried and confused but respecting Emma's apparent needs. She'd never refused to leave. She'd never caused distress. She'd gone home and sent a text message asking if Emma needed anything, if there was some way she could help. The text had gone unanswered. Margaret scrolled further down the birth plan, finding additional notes that made her stomach clench with each line. Patient expresses concern that mother may attempt to override medical decisions or interfere with newborn care protocols. Recommend security alert if Margaret Castellano attempts hospital access during delivery. Patient requests that mother not be added to emergency contact list and not be notified of delivery unless specifically requested by patient or spouse. Patient reports mother has history of alcohol abuse and emotional instability following death of patient's father. Concerns about fitness for grandparent role. The last line was a knife to Margaret's heart. Richard had died 15 years ago, in a car accident that had shattered their family. Yes, Margaret had struggled afterward. What widow wouldn't? She'd seen a therapist, had maybe relied too heavily on wine to get through the worst nights. But she'd never put Emma at risk. Never let her grief compromise her parenting. And she'd certainly never discussed those private struggles with Emma in any way that would justify this character assassination. Margaret sat back in her chair, the full scope of David's manipulation finally revealed. He hadn't just isolated Emma from her mother, he'd systematically poisoned her perception of their relationship, creating a fictional history of harassment and instability that justified his control. Each canceled plan, each unanswered text, each awkward interaction now made horrible sense. David had been feeding Emma lies about Margaret's behavior, probably claiming concern for Emma's well-being, while slowly convincing her that her mother was a threat to her happiness. The most insidious part was how he'd woven real events into his fabrications. Margaret had called about Emma's checkup results, but as a caring mother, not a demanding harasser. She had arrived at Emma's house on April 20th, but for a planned visit, not an unwanted intrusion. David had taken genuine expressions of love and concern and twisted them into evidence of dysfunction. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, she hoped it might be Emma, some cosmic alignment that would bring her daughter back to her in this moment of revelation. It was Janet. Can't sleep. Keep thinking about our girl. This isn't right, Margaret. A mother's instincts don't lie. Margaret stared at her mother's words, then back at the screen showing her daughter's birth plan. The birth plan that painted her as unstable, inappropriate, dangerous to her own grandchild's well-being. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her like a physical force. This wasn't just manipulation. It was character assassination. David had convinced Emma to fear her own mother, to see maternal love as harassment, protective concern as boundary violations. And Margaret had no way to fight back without revealing how she'd learned the truth. She screenshot the birth plan before closing the file, her hands moving automatically while her mind reeled with the implications. The evidence was damning, but obtaining it had required crossing ethical lines that could destroy her career. As she logged out of the system, Margaret felt the full weight of her actions settling over her. She'd violated every principle that governed her professional life. She'd breached patient confidentiality, accessed private medical records without authorization, and crossed boundaries that existed to protect both patients and healthcare workers. But she'd also uncovered a truth that might save her daughter from years of psychological manipulation. The question now was whether she was brave enough, or desperate enough, to use what she'd learned. As Margaret gathered her things and prepared to leave the hospital, she caught her reflection in the dark window of her office. She looked like a stranger to herself, haunted, desperate, capable of things she'd never imagined. David Ross had turned her into someone she didn't recognize, someone willing to break sacred trusts for love. The most terrifying part was that she wasn't sure she regretted it. Outside her office, the hospital hummed with the quiet activity of the night shift. Nurses padded through corridors, monitors beeped softly in patient rooms, and somewhere in the building, other families dealt with their own crises of love and loss and impossible choices. Margaret walked through the familiar halls carrying knowledge that could shatter her daughter's marriage and her own career in equal measure. The weight of it followed her home, where she sat in her kitchen until dawn, staring at the screenshot on her phone and wondering if truth was always worth the price of discovering it. The next morning, Margaret called in sick for the first time in 3 years. She sat at her kitchen table in the same clothes she'd worn to the hospital the night before, watching the sun rise over suburban Chicago, while her coffee grew cold in her hands. The screenshot of Emma's birth plan glowed on her phone screen like evidence of a crime, which, she supposed, it was. Sleep had been impossible. Every time Margaret closed her eyes, she saw the words that David had put in her daughter's mouth. Patient reports, mother has history of alcohol abuse and emotional instability. The clinical language made it worse somehow, transforming David's lies into medical fact, official documentation of her supposed failures as a mother. By Friday afternoon, Margaret forced herself back to work, but her colleagues noticed the change immediately. She fumbled through patient discharge meetings, lost track of conversations mid-sentence, and spent long periods staring at her computer screen without actually seeing it. Margaret? Dr. Sarah Chen appeared in her office doorway, concern etched across her features. Do you have a minute? Margaret minimized the spreadsheet she'd been pretending to review and gestured for Sarah to sit down. Of course, what's on your mind? Actually, I was going to ask you the same thing. Sarah closed the office door and settled into the chair across from Margaret's desk. You seem off lately, more than just family stress. Is everything okay? The urge to confess everything rose in Margaret's throat like bile. Sarah would understand the professional implications, would know how to handle the ethical violation. But she would also be obligated to report it, would have to choose between their friendship and her own professional responsibilities. "Just tired," Margaret managed. "Haven't been sleeping well." Sarah studied her with the same intensity she brought to examining patients. "Margaret, I've known you for 5 years. You've handled family crises before, personal loss, work stress. This feels different." It was different. Margaret had never carried the weight of knowing that her daughter was being systematically poisoned against her while being powerless to prove it without destroying her own life. "Sometimes family situations are more complicated than they appear," Margaret said carefully. "Yes, they are." Sarah leaned forward. "Which is why professional boundaries exist. They protect us from getting so emotionally invested that we compromise our judgment." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Sarah knew. Maybe not the details, but she suspected something. Margaret could see it in the careful way she was choosing her words, the concerned but cautious expression on her face. "Sarah." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Sarah said quickly. "I'm just reminding you that sometimes we think we're helping by bending rules, but we end up making things worse for everyone involved." After Sarah left, Margaret sat in her office feeling more isolated than ever. She couldn't tell Sarah the truth, couldn't risk involving her in the professional misconduct, but keeping the secret was eating her alive from the inside. Her phone buzzed with notifications from social media. Against her better judgment, Margaret opened Facebook and immediately regretted it. Photos from Emma's baby shower filled her feed. Images posted by family friends who didn't know about the family rift, or perhaps didn't care. Emma glowed in every picture, surrounded by gifts and laughter, her hands resting protectively on her rounded belly. She wore a flowing pink dress that accentuated her pregnancy, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. She looked beautiful, happy, radiant. She also looked tired. Margaret studied the photos with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. In some shots, Emma's smile seemed strained, her eyes carrying a weariness that had nothing to do with pregnancy fatigue. There was a moment, captured between formal poses, where Emma sat alone at the gift table, her expression distant and almost sad. David appeared in several photos, always positioned close to Emma, his hand on her shoulder or arm in a gesture that could be read as either protective or possessive. In one image, he was leaning over to whisper something in Emma's ear while she opened gifts, and Margaret could see tension in her daughter's shoulders that hadn't been there before her marriage. The comment section was filled with congratulations and well wishes, but Margaret noticed what was missing as much as what was present. No one asked about Margaret. No one commented on her absence. Either David had managed the narrative carefully, or people simply assumed there was some reasonable explanation for the mother of the pregnant woman not attending her own daughter's baby shower. Margaret's mother called that evening while she was still scrolling through photos, torturing herself with images of celebration she'd been excluded from. "You sound terrible," Janet said without preamble. "When's the last time you ate something?" Margaret couldn't remember. Food had lost all appeal since discovering Emma's birth plan. "I'm fine, Ma." "No, you're not. I'm coming over." "You don't need to." "Margaret Rose Castellano, I changed your diapers and held your head when you had the flu. Don't tell me what I need to do." 30 minutes later, Janet arrived with a container of homemade soup and the determined expression she'd worn when dealing with difficult teachers, skeptical doctors, and anyone else who underestimated her daughter over the years. "Sit," she commanded, bustling into Margaret's kitchen with the authority of someone who'd raised children through the Depression. "Eat, talk." Margaret dutifully spooned soup into her mouth while her mother settled into the chair across from her, sharp eyes taking inventory of Margaret's appearance. "You look like hell," Janet observed. "When's the last time you combed your hair or changed clothes?" "Ma!" Something happened. Something more than that snake disinviting you from the shower. Janet's voice carried the steel that had gotten her through immigration, widowhood, and decades of fighting for her family. "What aren't you telling me?" Margaret set down her spoon, her appetite disappearing entirely. "I can't talk about it. Can't or won't. Can't. Legally, professionally. It's complicated." Janet's eyes narrowed. "This has to do with your work." It wasn't a question, and Margaret's silence was answer enough. "Madonna mia," Janet whispered, lapsing into the Italian of her childhood as she did when emotions overwhelmed her. "What did you do?" "I found out the truth," Margaret said quietly. "About what David's been telling Emma. About why she won't see me, won't talk to me. Ma, it's worse than we thought." "How much worse?" Margaret looked at her mother, 82, years old, sharp as a blade, fierce in her loyalty to family. Janet had survived poverty, discrimination, the death of her husband, and the challenge of raising a daughter alone. She'd seen Margaret through Richard's death, through the dark months that followed, through every crisis and triumph of the past 15 years. If anyone could handle the truth, it was Janet Castellano. "He's been lying to her," Margaret said, "systematically, deliberately, making her think I'm unstable, dangerous. He's convinced her that my concern for her is harassment, that my love is boundary violation." Janet's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold fury that reminded Margaret why her mother had been formidable even as a young woman. "That bastard," Janet said with quiet venom. "How do you know?" Margaret hesitated, then told her mother about the birth plan, about the fabricated incidents, about the documentation that painted her as an alcoholic, unstable woman unfit to be around her own grandchild. She left out the part about accessing Emma's medical records illegally, but Janet was too smart to miss the implications. "How did you find this out?" Janet asked quietly. "I can't tell you that. Because it could get you in trouble. Because it could destroy my career." They sat in silence while Janet processed the information. Margaret watched her mother's face, saw the moment when understanding crystallized into determination. "We have to tell her," Janet said finally. "I can't. The way I found out. It would make everything worse. So we find another way." "What other way?" "Walk up to Emma and tell her that her husband has been systematically lying to her about her own mother. That he's manipulated her into fearing the woman who raised her, loved her, protected her for 28 years?" Margaret's voice cracked. "She won't believe it. And even if she did, learning the truth might cause more damage than the lies." Janet reached across the table and gripped Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "Listen to me, cara mia. I've seen this before. My grandmother, back in Sicily, she told stories about men like this. They isolate their wives, turn them against their families, make them dependent and afraid. This isn't Sicily in 1920, Ma. Abuse is abuse, no matter what century it happens in." Janet's voice carried absolute certainty. "And that's what this is, psychological abuse. He's stealing our Emma piece by piece, making her forget who she really is." Margaret felt tears she'd been holding back for days finally spill over. "I don't know how to fight this. I don't know how to save her without destroying myself in the process." "Then we get help," Janet said firmly. "We find people who understand this kind of situation. We build a case the right way. What if it's too late? What if he's already won?" Janet's grip tightened on Margaret's hand. "He hasn't won until we stop fighting. And Castellano women don't surrender, not when family is at stake." For the first time in days, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Not because the situation had changed, but because she wasn't carrying the burden alone anymore. Janet might not know all the details of how Margaret had obtained her information, but she understood the stakes. "What do we do?" Margaret asked. "First, you go take a shower and get some sleep. Then tomorrow, we start making phone calls." There are people who specialize in this kind of family manipulation, counselors who understand what we're dealing with. And if Emma won't listen? Janet's expression hardened with resolve. Then we make sure she can't ignore us. But carefully, legally, without giving that snake any ammunition to use against you. As Margaret finally headed upstairs for the first real rest she'd had in days, she felt some of the weight lifting from her shoulders. The knowledge was still there, still dangerous, still carrying the potential to destroy everything she'd worked for. But now she wasn't carrying it alone. And in the morning, the fight for Emma's freedom would begin in earnest. Margaret woke Monday morning feeling more rested than she had in weeks, though the weight of her secret still pressed against her chest like a stone. Janet's words from the night before echoed in her mind. Castellano women don't surrender. Not when family is at stake. But knowing she had an ally and knowing how to proceed were two different things entirely. She was reviewing patient discharge summaries when her office phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer, instead of letting it go to voicemail. Margaret Castellano, Patient Services. Mrs. Castellano, this is Lisa Park, Emma's friend? I hope you don't mind me calling you at work, but I wasn't sure how else to reach you. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. Lisa Park, the maid of honor at Emma's wedding, the organizer of the baby shower Margaret had been banned from attending, the young woman who'd been Emma's closest friend since college, and who probably knew more about Emma's marriage than anyone else in the family. Of course, Lisa. What can I do for you? There was a pause, filled with the kind of hesitation that suggested Lisa was choosing her words carefully. I was wondering if we could talk. About Emma. About the situation. Margaret's heart began to race. What situation? I think you know. Lisa's voice was quiet but firm. Mrs. Castellano, I organized Emma's baby shower, and I noticed you weren't there. When I asked Emma about it, she gave me some vague answer about family complications and stress. But I've been thinking about it all weekend, and something doesn't feel right. Margaret closed her office door and lowered her voice. What do you mean? Could we meet somewhere? This feels like the kind of conversation that should happen face to face. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown during Margaret's lunch break. Margaret spent the morning alternating between hope and anxiety, wondering what Lisa might have observed about David's behavior, what she might know about the systematic exclusion that had torn Margaret's relationship with Emma apart. The coffee shop was busy with the lunch crowd, providing enough ambient noise for private conversation. Margaret spotted Lisa immediately, a petite Asian woman in her late 20s. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With intelligent eyes and the kind of direct manner that probably made her effective in her work as a social worker, Lisa had already claimed a corner table, 2 cups of coffee waiting. She stood when Margaret approached, extending a hand with a firm grip that suggested she was as nervous as Margaret but equally determined. Thank you for meeting me, Lisa said as they settled into their chairs. I wasn't sure you'd want to talk to me, given that I was part of the shower you were excluded from. You organized a beautiful event, Margaret said carefully. Emma looked happy in the photos. Did she? Lisa's eyebrows rose. Because I was there, and I'm not sure happy is the word I'd use. She looked tired, stressed, and, honestly, kind of sad. Especially when people asked about you. Margaret's breath caught. People asked about me? Of course they did. You're her mother, you helped raise money for the shower, and everyone expected you to be there. Emma kept giving these rehearsed responses about family stress and needing space, but they didn't sound like her words. Lisa leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Mrs. Castellano, I've been Emma's friend for 8 years. I know how she talks, how she thinks, how she handles stress. The woman at that baby shower wasn't the Emma I know. What do you mean? I mean she was performing, going through the motions of happiness while looking over her shoulder every few minutes to check David's reaction to whatever she was saying or doing. And David. Lisa paused, gathering her thoughts. David was managing every interaction like he was directing a play. Margaret felt validation and horror in equal measure. Can you give me an example? Lisa pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos. Look at this one, she said, showing Margaret an image from the gift-opening portion of the shower. See how David is standing. He's positioned so he can see everyone who approaches Emma, monitor every conversation. And look at Emma's body language. She's turned slightly toward him even while opening gifts, like she's checking for approval. Margaret studied the photo with the intensity she'd brought to examining her daughter's birth plan. Lisa was right. Emma's posture showed unconscious deference to David's presence, a subtle but constant awareness of his reactions. It gets worse, Lisa continued, swiping to another photo. This was when someone brought up the nursery decorations. Emma started to mention some ideas she had, and David interrupted to correct her. Said they'd already decided on a different theme entirely, something more practical. The look on Emma's face. Lisa shook her head. She just shut down. Stopped contributing to her own baby shower conversation. Did anyone else notice? A few people. Emma's cousin Julie asked me afterward if everything was okay with Emma and David. Said Emma seemed different since the wedding. Lisa sat down her phone and looked directly at Margaret. Mrs. Castellano, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Margaret braced herself. What is it? Did you do something to warrant being excluded from your daughter's baby shower? Because I've watched David systematically discourage Emma from mentioning you for months now. He changes the subject when your name comes up, suggests alternative plans when Emma talks about visiting you, and I've seen him delete texts from his phone without showing them to Emma. The last revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. You've seen him delete texts? We were all having dinner a few months ago, and Emma's phone was charging in the kitchen. David's phone kept buzzing with texts, and I saw him glance at them and delete several without saying anything. When Emma asked if anyone had been trying to reach her, he said no. Margaret felt sick. Not only had David been feeding Emma lies about her behavior, he'd been intercepting her attempts to communicate, making Emma think her mother was pulling away when the opposite was true. There's more, Lisa continued. I've been thinking about this for weeks, actually. David's behavior during the wedding planning was concerning. He had opinions about everything, the guest list, the menu, the flowers, but it was the way he expressed those opinions, always framed as what would be best for Emma, or what would reduce Emma's stress. Did Emma seem stressed? Not until David started pointing out all the things that were supposedly stressing her. It was like he was creating problems so he could solve them, making himself indispensable while making Emma doubt her own judgment. Margaret thought about her conversation with Janet, about her mother's recognition of psychological abuse patterns. Lisa was describing the same systematic undermining of Emma's autonomy that Margaret had discovered in the birth plan. Lisa, why are you telling me this? Lisa's expression hardened with determination. Because Emma is my friend and I'm watching her disappear. The woman who married David is becoming a shadow of the person I knew in college. She used to be decisive, confident, funny. Now she second-guesses everything and speaks in David's talking points. What can we do about it? I was hoping you could tell me, as her mother, as someone who's known her longer than anyone except family. Lisa hesitated. Mrs. Castellano, I have to ask, is there anything about your relationship with Emma that might explain David's behavior? Any real conflicts or problems that might justify his protection of her? The question hung in the air between them. Margaret understood what Lisa was really asking. Was David's control justified by some actual dysfunction in Margaret's behavior? Or was he manufacturing problems to isolate Emma? No, Margaret said quietly. There's nothing. We've had normal mother-daughter disagreements over the years, but nothing that would warrant the kind of exclusion you're describing. I love Emma. I've supported every major decision she's made, including marrying David, even when I had concerns. What kind of concerns? Margaret thought about how much to reveal, how much Lisa could handle knowing. David has always been very attentive to Emma, protective in ways that sometimes felt more possessive than caring. But Emma seemed happy, so I told myself I was being an overprotective mother. You weren't wrong, Lisa said firmly. I've seen David's protection up close. It looks like love from the outside, but it functions like control. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the implications of what they'd shared. Finally, Lisa spoke again. Mrs. Castellano, I think Emma is in an emotionally abusive relationship. And I think David has convinced her that you're the problem so she won't have anyone to turn to when she starts to recognize what's happening. The clinical term, emotionally abusive relationship, made everything feel more real and more terrifying. Margaret had suspected manipulation, but hearing it named by someone with professional training in recognizing abuse patterns gave it weight that her maternal instincts alone couldn't provide. What do we do? Margaret asked. Carefully, Lisa said. People in Emma's situation don't usually respond well to direct confrontation about their partner's behavior. David has spent months convincing her that you're the threat to her happiness. If we approach this wrong, it could drive her further into isolation. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Chen. Need to see you in my office when you get back. Important. Margaret's stomach dropped. Sarah's message was professional, formal, nothing like their usual casual communication. I have to get back to work, Margaret said, showing Lisa the text. But I'm glad you called. I'm glad Emma has someone watching out for her. We need to stay in touch, Lisa said, handing Margaret her business card. I have some ideas about how to approach this, but I need to do some research first. There are protocols for helping people in psychologically abusive relationships. As Margaret walked back to the hospital, her mind raced with everything Lisa had revealed. The intercepted texts, the systematic undermining of Emma's confidence, the performance of happiness at her own baby shower. It painted a picture of manipulation far more sophisticated than Margaret had imagined. But it also provided validation, that she wasn't losing her mind, that her instincts about David's behavior were accurate. Emma was in trouble, and now Margaret had an ally who understood the complexity of the situation. The problem was that Margaret also had growing professional troubles that could undermine any attempt to help her daughter. Sarah was waiting in her office when Margaret returned, her expression serious and concerned. She gestured for Margaret to sit down and close the door. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Margaret's heart began to race. Of course. Have you accessed any patient files outside the scope of your normal duties recently? The question landed like a bomb. Margaret felt her face flush, felt the careful composure she'd maintained crumbling under Sarah's direct gaze. Sarah, Marcus flagged some unusual access patterns in last week's security review. Your login was used to view obstetrics files that aren't related to any of your current cases. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. Margaret, please tell me you didn't do what I think you did. Margaret looked at her friend and colleague, saw the concern and disappointment warring in Sarah's expression. She thought about Emma's birth plan, about David's lies, about the systematic campaign to isolate her daughter from everyone who truly loved her. I can't discuss it, Margaret said quietly. That's an answer in itself. Sarah leaned back in, her chair running a hand through her hair. Margaret, do you understand what this means? If Marcus reports this, and he's obligated to, you could lose your job. Your license. Everything you've worked for. I understand. Then why? Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. Why would you risk everything for information you had no right to access? Margaret met her friend's eyes, seeing years of shared professional respect and personal friendship reflected there. Because sometimes the people we love are in danger, and the systems that are supposed to protect them become the barriers that prevent us from helping them. Sarah stared at her for a long moment, understanding dawning in her expression. This is about Emma. I can't discuss specifics. You don't have to. I can see it in your face, hear it in your voice. Sarah leaned forward. Margaret, whatever you found in those files, whatever you think you need to do with that information, please think carefully about the consequences, not just for you, but for Emma too. What do you mean? I mean that if you've crossed ethical lines to obtain information about your daughter's care and that comes to light, it could damage her trust in the medical system, in her own care providers. It could harm the very person you're trying to protect. Margaret felt the weight of Sarah's words settling over her like a shroud. She'd been so focused on the truth she'd discovered that she hadn't fully considered how her method of discovering it could harm Emma if it became public. What should I do? Margaret asked. Pray that Marcus decides not to pursue this further, and find another way to help Emma that doesn't involve compromising your professional integrity. As Sarah left her office, Margaret sat alone with the crushing realization that her attempt to protect Emma might have created new dangers for both of them. She'd gained an ally in Lisa, but she'd also put herself in a position where her professional misconduct could become another weapon David could use against her. The fight for Emma's freedom was becoming more complicated and more dangerous with each passing day, and Margaret was running out of time to find a solution that wouldn't destroy them both. The next evening, Margaret sat in her living room with Lisa Park, both women surrounded by notebooks, printed emails, and a timeline they'd been constructing for the past 3 hours. What had started as a simple meeting to compare observations had evolved into something approaching a formal investigation. Look at this pattern, Lisa said, pointing to entries on their timeline. Every major decision point in Emma's life over the past year, David has managed to position himself as the voice of reason while painting everyone else, especially you, as sources of stress or conflict. Margaret studied the documentation they'd assembled. Lisa had proven to be remarkably organized, bringing printed screenshots of text conversations, notes from wedding planning meetings, and detailed observations of David's behavior during various social gatherings. Here, Lisa continued, flipping to a page of notes from Emma's bachelorette party. Emma wanted to have the party at that wine bar downtown where you two used to go for your monthly dinners. But David convinced her it would be too emotional to choose a place with so many memories of family stress. Family stress? Margaret's voice sharpened. Our dinners weren't stressful. They were the highlight of my month. Exactly. But David reframed them as something negative, something Emma needed to distance herself from for her own emotional health. Lisa pulled out another set of notes. He did the same thing with the guest list. Emma originally wanted to seat you at the family table with her cousin Julie and Uncle Frank. But David suggested that might create tension and convinced her to put you at a separate table with his business associates, people you'd never met. Margaret remembered that wedding reception, remembered feeling isolated and confused about why she'd been placed with strangers while Emma's other relatives sat together. At the time, she'd attributed it to the natural chaos of wedding planning. Now she saw it for what it was, a deliberate strategy to make her feel like an outsider at her own daughter's wedding. What about the honeymoon? Margaret asked. Emma mentioned they were considering Italy, which made sense since she's always loved hearing Janet's stories about Sicily. Lisa's expression darkened. David vetoed Italy, said it would be too overwhelming for Emma to deal with the emotional weight of visiting places connected to her family history. They went to Hawaii instead, somewhere with no personal significance, no connections to anyone but David. Margaret felt a chill of recognition. David hadn't just been isolating Emma from her mother, he'd been systematically severing her connections to her entire family history, her cultural identity, the stories and traditions that had shaped her childhood. "I brought copies of some text exchanges from the wedding planning period," Lisa said, pulling out her phone. "With your permission, I'd like to read you a few things Emma said about you during that time." Margaret nodded, though she braced herself for more evidence of David's manipulation. Lisa scrolled through old messages. "This is from March, about 2 months before the wedding. Emma texted me. David thinks Mom is getting too involved in the planning. Says she's putting pressure on me to make choices that reflect her preferences instead of ours. I don't know what to think. I love Mom, but I want this to be about me and David, not about managing family drama." "I never pressured her about wedding choices," Margaret said quietly. "I offered to help with whatever she needed and stayed out of decisions that weren't my business." "I know. And here's the thing. A week earlier, Emma had texted me excited about how helpful you'd been with vendor research and how grateful she was for your support." Lisa showed Margaret the message thread. "Look at the difference in tone. It's like someone coached her to reinterpret your helpfulness as interference." They continued through the timeline, documenting a pattern of subtle manipulation that stretched back to the early months of Emma's relationship with David. Lisa had notes from conversations where David would casually mention Margaret's boundary issues or suggest that Emma's stress levels improved when she had space from family obligations. "The most insidious part," Lisa explained, "is how David never directly criticized you. He always framed his concerns in terms of Emma's well-being. I just want what's best for Emma. Emma seems so much more relaxed when she doesn't have to worry about family expectations. It made it almost impossible for Emma to defend you without seeming like she was choosing conflict over peace." Margaret thought about her own interactions with David over the past year, realizing how carefully he'd managed their conversations. He'd always been polite, even warm, but there had been subtle digs disguised as concern, gentle suggestions that Emma needed support dealing with family stress. "He told different stories to different people," Margaret said suddenly. "To Emma, I was overbearing and boundary crossing, but to other family members." "What did he tell them?" Margaret pulled out her own notes, compiled from phone calls with relatives over the past few days. "To my cousin Marie, he said I was struggling emotionally with Emma's independence and needed time to adjust. To Emma's godmother, he suggested I was having health issues that made me unpredictable. To my neighbor Helen, he mentioned that I'd been difficult since Richard's death and that Emma was trying to manage my emotional needs while dealing with her pregnancy." Lisa stared at her. So he created a different narrative for each person, all designed to make them think Emma's distance from you was either justified or necessary for your own well-being. Exactly. And because everyone heard a different version, no one realized they were all lies. They worked in focused silence for another hour, cross-referencing dates and events, building a comprehensive picture of David's systematic campaign to isolate Emma. The evidence was overwhelming when viewed as a whole, but Margaret knew it would be difficult to present to Emma in a way she could accept. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "How's the investigation going? Need me to bring more coffee?" Despite the seriousness of their work, Margaret smiled. Her mother had insisted on contributing to their efforts, bringing food and offering to help with research. Janet's sharp instincts and fierce determination had proven invaluable. "Your mother is something else," Lisa said, having overheard Janet's text. "She called me this morning with questions about Emma's behavior at the wedding reception. Asked me if I'd noticed whether Emma ate enough dinner or if she seemed nervous about anything specific." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That Emma barely touched her food and kept looking around like she was checking to make sure everyone was having a good time. Your mother said that wasn't normal behavior for Emma, that she'd always been someone who enjoyed parties and celebrations without worrying about everyone else's experience. Margaret nodded. Emma had been a natural hostess since childhood, someone who found joy in bringing people together. The anxious, performance-focused woman Lisa described from the wedding was a stranger. "We need to think about how to approach Emma with this information," Lisa said. "Direct confrontation about David's behavior will likely trigger his defensive strategies. He'll frame any criticism as an attack on their marriage, on Emma's happiness. What do you suggest? Gradual re-engagement. Find ways to reconnect. With Emma that don't threaten David's sense of control. Show her through actions, not words, that your relationship with her doesn't have to be a source of stress or conflict." Margaret considered this approach. It made sense from a psychological standpoint, but it also required patience she wasn't sure she possessed. Every day that passed was another day of David's manipulation taking deeper root. "There's something else we need to consider," Lisa said carefully. "Emma's due date is only 2 months away. If we're going to intervene, it needs to be soon. Once the baby arrives, David will have even more leverage to control the situation." Margaret felt the weight of time pressure settling over her like a heavy cloak. 2 months to somehow break through years of systematic manipulation, to rebuild a relationship that had been deliberately poisoned, to convince her daughter that the man she loved was the source of problems he'd convinced her came from her own mother. Meanwhile, at Mercy General Hospital, Marcus Thompson was working late in his administrative office, reviewing the quarterly security audit reports that had landed on his desk that afternoon. The routine review of system access logs was typically straightforward. A few minor policy violations, some password reset requests, the occasional inappropriate access that required a gentle reminder about professional boundaries. But tonight, something had caught his attention. Margaret Castellano's access history showed an unusual pattern. Her login had been used to view patient files in the obstetrics department outside her normal scope of responsibility. Specifically, she'd accessed the records of Emma Castellano Ross on a Thursday evening when Margaret should have been off duty. Marcus had worked with Margaret for over 5 years, knew her to be scrupulously ethical and professional in her handling of patient information. This kind of breach was completely out of character, which made it more concerning rather than less. He pulled up Emma's file information, noting the family relationship that explained Margaret's interest. But understanding motivation didn't excuse the violation of patient privacy protocols. In fact, family relationships made such breaches more serious, not less, because they suggested personal rather than professional reasons for accessing confidential information. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering his options. He could handle this quietly with a verbal warning, trusting Margaret's professionalism to ensure it never happened again. Or he could follow protocol and file a formal violation report, which would trigger an investigation and likely result in disciplinary action. The choice should have been easy. Hospital policies existed for good reasons, and allowing exceptions, even for valued employees with personal situations, set dangerous precedents. But Margaret had been struggling lately, clearly dealing with some kind of family crisis. Marcus had noticed her distraction, her uncharacteristic mistakes, the emotional weight she seemed to be carrying. Filing a formal report would likely end her career at a time when she was already under tremendous stress. Marcus saved the security report to his desktop, still undecided about how to proceed. He'd need to address the situation, but he wanted to think carefully about the best approach. Margaret deserved a chance to explain herself before he made any decisions that could destroy her professional life. Back in Margaret's living room, she and Lisa were finalizing their strategy for re-engaging with Emma. They'd identified several low-pressure opportunities for contact. Emma's upcoming prenatal appointment that Lisa knew about, a baby registry completion that might provide an excuse for gift-giving, Emma's birthday in 6 weeks that no one could reasonably object to celebrating. The key is patience, Lisa emphasized. We need to show Emma that her relationship with you can exist without drama or conflict. Let David's own behavior contrast with your reasonable, supportive approach. Margaret understood the strategy, but patience felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Every instinct screamed at her to act quickly, to confront the situation directly, to fight for her daughter with the fierce urgency that maternal love demanded. But Lisa was right. Direct confrontation would likely drive Emma further into David's arms, further from the truth that might eventually set her free. As Lisa gathered her notes and prepared to leave, Margaret felt a complex mixture of hope and anxiety. They had a plan, solid evidence of David's manipulation, and a growing alliance of people who cared about Emma's well-being. But they also had limited time, a target who'd been conditioned to distrust the very people trying to help her, and professional consequences looming that could undermine everything they were trying to accomplish. The investigation had revealed the scope of David's deception, but it had also shown them the magnitude of the challenge they faced in fighting it. Margaret stood at her window after Lisa left, watching the lights in her neighbor's windows and thinking about Emma just a few miles away, probably settling in for the evening with a man who'd convinced her that her mother was the enemy. Tomorrow, the careful work of rebuilding that relationship would begin. Tonight, Margaret could only hope it wouldn't be too late. Margaret arrived at work Tuesday morning to find a message waiting on her voicemail. "Margaret, this is Marcus. Thompson, please come to my office as soon as you get in. We need to discuss some security audit findings." The formal tone made her stomach clench. Margaret had worked with Marcus long enough to recognize the difference between his casual, collegial manner and the careful professionalism he adopted when dealing with policy violations. This was definitely the latter. She spent 10 minutes in the restroom, splashing cold water on her face and trying to prepare for a conversation that could end her career. When she finally knocked on Marcus's office door, her hands were steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. "Come in, Margaret, please close the door behind you." Marcus's office was functional rather than warm. Beige walls, institutional furniture, motivational posters about teamwork and patient care that had probably been there since the hospital opened. Marcus himself sat behind his desk with a computer, printout spread in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. "Please have a seat." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "I need to discuss some irregularities that came up in our quarterly security review." Margaret sat down, keeping her expression calm despite the panic rising in her chest. "What kind of irregularities?" Marcus turned his computer monitor so she could see the screen. "Your login was used to access patient files in obstetrics last Thursday evening, specifically the records of Emma Castellano Ross." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I assume you know why that's a problem." The evidence was right there in black and white. Login timestamps, file access records, a digital trail that led directly to her breach of professional ethics. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief. The waiting was over. The consequences she'd been dreading were finally here. "Yes," she said quietly. "I know why it's a problem." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from administrative firmness to human concern. "Margaret, I've worked with you for 5 years. You're one of the most ethical, dedicated employees in this department. This is completely out of character for you." "I understand that." "Then help me understand what happened. Why would you risk your career, your professional reputation, everything you've worked for, to access your daughter's medical records without authorization?" Margaret looked at Marcus, a good man trying to do his job while maintaining compassion for someone he respected, and realized she had to make a choice. She could lie, try to minimize what she'd done, claim it was a moment of parental curiosity. That got out of hand. Or she could tell him enough of the truth to help him understand why she'd crossed lines she'd never imagined crossing. "My daughter is in trouble," Margaret said slowly. "Her husband has been systematically isolating her from her family, manipulating her relationships, convincing her that people who love her are threats to her well-being." Marcus's expression shifted, showing the first hint of understanding. "That's concerning." But it doesn't justify accessing confidential medical records. I know it doesn't. But I was desperate to understand what was happening, to figure out why Emma had suddenly shut me out of her life completely. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. Marcus, I haven't had a real conversation with my daughter in months. I was banned from her baby shower. I've been excluded from doctor's appointments, family planning discussions, everything related to my first grandchild. Have you considered that there might be legitimate reasons for Emma's decisions? That maybe she genuinely needs space from family stress during her pregnancy? Margaret met his eyes directly. What I found in those files prove that Emma's decisions aren't her own. Her husband has been feeding her lies about my behavior, creating false documentation of incidents that never happened, convincing her that I'm unstable and dangerous. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Margaret, even if everything you're saying is true, you still violated patient confidentiality. You accessed private medical information without authorization. That's not just a policy violation. It's potentially a criminal offense. I understand the severity of what I did. Do you? Because right now, I have to decide whether to handle this quietly with a written warning and mandatory ethics training, or file a formal violation report that will trigger an investigation by the state licensing board. Margaret felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. What would you recommend? I'd recommend that you help me understand whether this was an isolated incident driven by extraordinary family circumstances or part of a pattern of ethical lapses that pose ongoing risks to patient privacy. It was isolated, it was desperate, and it was wrong. Margaret paused, gathering her courage, but it was also necessary. Marcus's eyebrows rose. Necessary? My daughter is being psychologically abused by her husband. The medical records contained evidence of systematic manipulation designed to isolate her from everyone who might help her recognize what's happening. If I hadn't accessed those files, I might never have understood the full scope of what she's dealing with. And what do you plan to do with that information? The question hung in the air between them. Margaret realized that Marcus was asking not just about her past actions, but about her future intentions. Whether she could be trusted to respect professional boundaries going forward, or whether her family crisis would continue to drive her toward ethical violations. I'm working with other people who care about Emma to approach this situation carefully and legally, Margaret said. I won't access any more files. I won't use my position at the hospital to gather information about my daughter's care. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Margaret, I want to help you, both professionally and personally, but I have responsibilities to the hospital, to our patients, to the integrity of our privacy policies. I understand. I'm going to give you a choice. You can resign your position effective immediately, with a neutral reference letter that doesn't mention the circumstances of your departure. Or I can file the formal violation report and let the investigation proceed through official channels. Margaret felt her professional world crumbling around her. 15 years of building trust, reputation, and expertise destroyed by one desperate decision to protect her daughter. How long do I have to decide? End of business today. After leaving Marcus's office, Margaret walked through the hospital corridors in a daze. Colleagues greeted her with the same casual warmth they always had, unaware that she was likely experiencing her last day as their coworker. She thought about the patients she'd advocated for, the families she'd helped navigate medical crises, the professional identity that had sustained her through widowhood and single parenthood. All of it was about to disappear because she'd chosen her daughter over her career. She was reviewing discharge summaries when Dr. Sarah Chen knocked on her office door. "Can we talk?" Sarah asked, her expression serious. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she could handle another difficult conversation. Sarah closed the door and sat down, her movements careful and deliberate. Marcus told me about the security audit findings, Sarah said without preamble. Margaret's heart sank. Sarah. He's struggling with how to handle the situation. He asked for my perspective on the family circumstances that might have contributed to your decision. What did you tell him? That I've been watching you struggle with a family crisis for weeks, that your behavior has been completely out of character, and that I believe this was an isolated incident driven by extraordinary circumstances. Sarah paused. I also told him that you're one of the most ethical people I know, and that whatever drove you to access those files must have been serious. Margaret felt tears threatening. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Sarah leaned forward. What you found in Emma's medical records, was it worth destroying your career? The question cut straight to the heart of Margaret's dilemma. Was the truth about David's manipulation worth losing everything she'd worked for professionally? Was saving Emma worth sacrificing her own future? Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. My daughter is being systematically abused, and I was the only person in a position to uncover the evidence that proves it. And what are you going to do with that evidence? Everything I can to save her. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression reflecting the same moral struggle that Margaret had been wrestling with for days. Margaret, I need to tell you something that I probably shouldn't. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Emma is my patient. Margaret's breath caught. What? Dr. Williams is on vacation this week. Emma had some concerns about Braxton Hicks' contractions yesterday, so she came in for an unscheduled appointment. I was the attending physician. Margaret stared at her friend, processing the implications. How is she? Physically, she's fine. The contractions are normal, nothing to worry about. But Margaret... Sarah hesitated. I've never seen a pregnant woman so anxious about discussing her birth plan with a medical professional. She kept checking her phone, seemed nervous about sharing basic information about her support system. What did she say about her support system? That her husband was handling all the logistics, that he'd be her primary advocate during delivery. When I asked about other family support, specifically about you, she became visibly distressed and said there were complicated family dynamics that made additional support impossible. Margaret felt validation and heartbreak in equal measure. Even in a medical setting, Emma was parroting David's narrative about family complications. Sarah, what I found in those files... I can't discuss patient information with you, Margaret. You know that. Sarah's voice was firm but not unkind. But I can tell you that if a patient's family situation concerns me from a safety perspective, I have protocols to follow. The implication was clear. Sarah had observed something troubling about Emma's situation during their appointment, something that raised professional concerns about her safety and well-being. What kind of protocols? Social work consultations? Safety assessments? Resources? For patients who might be experiencing domestic issues. Sarah met Margaret's eyes. Margaret, I want you to know that Emma isn't alone, even if she feels like she is. After Sarah left, Margaret sat in her office feeling the full weight of her converging crises. Her professional life was ending, but Emma's situation was finally being recognized by people with the training and authority to help her properly. The question now was whether Margaret would be around to see the outcome of the fight she'd started. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. Emma just called me. She's having anxiety about the birth plan and wants to talk. Can you meet me tonight? I think it's time to make our move. Margaret stared at the message, realizing that her professional consequences were arriving at the same moment that an opportunity to help Emma was presenting itself. She had until the end of the day to decide whether to resign or face formal investigation, and tonight might be her last chance to reach her daughter before everything she'd sacrificed was for nothing. She typed back, "Yes, whatever it takes." As Margaret prepared to leave the hospital for what might be the last time as an employee, she thought about the choice she'd made in accessing Emma's files. It had cost her everything professionally, But it had also set in motion a series of events that might finally free her daughter from David's manipulation. Some prices were worth paying, even when the cost was everything you'd worked for. Some fights were worth having, even when you knew you might lose everything in the process. And some truths were worth telling, even when the telling destroyed the teller. Margaret gathered her personal belongings, said goodbye to colleagues who didn't know they were saying goodbye, and walked out of Mercy General Hospital carrying the weight of consequences she'd chosen and the hope that they would ultimately serve a purpose greater than her own professional survival. Margaret sat in her car outside Emma's house for 20 minutes, watching the quiet suburban street and gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. It was Tuesday afternoon, a time when David would be at his consulting firm downtown, leaving Emma alone for what might be the first time in months. Lisa's text from the night before had been brief but urgent. Emma called me crying about the birth plan. She's scared and confused. David left for a business trip this morning, back tomorrow. Evening, this might be our only chance. The house looked the same as it had during Margaret's previous visits, modest but well-maintained, with the small garden Emma had been so excited to plant when they'd first moved in. But now, Margaret noticed details that had escaped her before. Security cameras at the front door, drawn curtains despite the beautiful afternoon, an overall sense of isolation that seemed intentional rather than coincidental. Margaret walked up the familiar path and knocked gently on the door. She heard movement inside, footsteps approaching cautiously. When the door opened, Emma's face appeared in the gap, her expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like fear. "Mom, what are you doing here?" Emma looked exhausted. At nearly 8 months pregnant, she carried the natural tiredness of late pregnancy. But there was something deeper in her eyes, a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore an oversized sweater that seemed designed to hide rather than flatter her pregnant figure. "I came to see you," Margaret said simply. "We need to talk." David isn't here. He's traveling for work." "I know. I came." "To see you, Emma. Just you?" Emma's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a protective gesture that made Margaret's heart ache. When had her daughter started feeling the need to protect herself from her own mother? "I don't think that's a good idea," Emma said quietly. "Things have been complicated lately." "Emma, please, 5 minutes. I just want to understand what's happening between us." Emma hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure she was truly alone. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Okay, but just for a few minutes." Margaret followed her daughter into the living room, noting changes since her last visit. Family photos that had once included Margaret had been moved to less prominent locations, replaced by pictures of Emma and David alone. The warm, welcoming atmosphere Emma had always created in her living spaces felt muted, controlled. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the distance between them feeling like a chasm. Emma kept her hands folded over her belly, her posture defensive despite having invited Margaret inside. "Emma," Margaret began carefully, "I need you to help me understand what I've done wrong. Why I've been shut out of your pregnancy, your baby shower, your life." Emma's eyes filled with tears immediately. "Mom, it's complicated." "Then help me understand the complications." "You've been..." Emma paused, clearly struggling with her words. "David says you've been having trouble with boundaries. That you've been putting pressure on me, making demands that stress me out." Margaret felt her heart breaking as she heard David's lies coming from her daughter's mouth. "What kind of demands?" "Like insisting on coming to doctor's appointments when I said I wanted privacy, showing up here unannounced when I asked for space, calling constantly when I didn't answer right away." Each accusation hit Margaret like a physical blow because they were based on twisted versions of real events. She had offered to attend appointments, had visited when plans were confirmed, had called when Emma seemed to be pulling away. but David had reframed every expression of maternal love as evidence of inappropriate behavior. Emma, when did I insist on coming to doctor's appointments? When did I show up here unannounced without a prior arrangement? Emma's brow furrowed, the first crack in her certainty appearing. David said, "He told me about the times when..." "When what?" Emma. "Can you think of a specific incident where I did any of those things?" Emma's voice wavered. "I was so emotional during the early pregnancy, everything felt overwhelming. David handled most of the communication with family to protect me from stress." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. David hadn't just been lying to Emma about Margaret's behavior. He'd positioned himself as the filter for all family communication, controlling what information Emma received and how it was framed. "Emma, do you remember the last time we had a private conversation? Just the two of us, without David present?" Emma opened her mouth to answer, then closed it. Her eyes moved around the room as if searching for a memory that wouldn't come. "I don't. We talk all the time." "When was the last time you called me directly? Not to relay information David asked you to share, but because you wanted to talk to your mother?" The silence stretched between them. Margaret watched her daughter's face as Emma tried to remember a conversation that Margaret now realized probably hadn't happened in months. "David says I shouldn't burden you with pregnancy complaints when you're dealing with your own issues," Emma said finally. "What issues?" "Your emotional problems. Since Dad died. David said you've been struggling with alcohol and depression, that my independence has been hard for you to accept." Margaret stared at her daughter, seeing the full scope of David's manipulation laid bare. He'd taken her private moments of grief from 15 years ago and twisted them into current mental health issues. He'd reframed Emma's natural growth into adulthood as rejection that Margaret couldn't handle. "Emma, I'm not struggling with alcohol or depression. I haven't had those issues for over a decade, and your independence isn't hard for me to accept. It's what I raised you to achieve." Emma's composure began to crack. "But David said, he's been protecting me from your calls when you've been drinking and emotional." "Emma, when was the last time you actually spoke to me when I was drinking? Can you remember a specific conversation?" Again, Emma searched her memory and came up empty. Margaret could see the confusion growing in her daughter's eyes as she tried to reconcile David's stories with her actual experiences. "I'm so confused," Emma whispered, tears starting to flow. "David says you've been difficult, that you've made comments about him not being good enough for me. But I can't remember you ever saying anything negative about him directly to me." Margaret chose her next words carefully. "Emma, I want you to think about something. Over the past year, how many of your decisions about our relationship have been based on conversations you had directly with me, and how many have been based on what David told you about my behavior or feelings?" Emma's breathing became shallow as she processed the question. Margaret could see her daughter's mental timeline shifting, memories reorganizing themselves as she began to separate her actual experiences from the narrative David had constructed. "Oh my God," Emma whispered. Most of them. Most of my decisions about you have been based on what David told me you said or did. And in those direct conversations we did have, did I seem drunk? Emotional? Inappropriate?" "No," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "You seemed hurt, confused, like you didn't understand why I was pulling away." Margaret felt tears threatening, but forced herself to stay composed. This was the breakthrough she'd been hoping for, but she had to be careful not to push too hard, or Emma might retreat back into David's version of reality. "Emma, I need to ask you something difficult. Has David ever told you I said or did something that, when you really think about it, doesn't sound like me?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her hands moving in slow circles over her belly. When she spoke, her voice was shaky. He said you told him that you thought he wasn't good enough for me because he didn't come from money. But that doesn't. You've never cared about money. You raised me to value character over status. What else? He said you were angry about not being included in wedding planning decisions, that you made snide comments about how he was changing me. But you never make snide comments. You're direct when you have concerns. Margaret watched her daughter's worldview crumbling in real time. Each memory Emma re-examined revealed another layer of David's deception, another instance where he'd attributed words or actions to Margaret that were completely inconsistent with her character. Emma, I need to tell you something else. I've never said anything negative about David to him or anyone else. My only concern has been that you seemed to be pulling away from family, from the relationships that had always been important to you. Emma broke down completely then, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. Margaret moved closer on the couch, instinctively reaching to comfort her daughter, then stopping when she realized that physical contact might feel overwhelming given everything Emma was processing. Why would he do this? Emma gasped between sobs. Why would he make me think my own mother was? Why would he lie about you? Margaret knew the answer, but she also knew that Emma needed to reach that understanding on her own. What do you think? Control, Emma whispered. He wanted to control who I talked to, what I believed, how I saw my own family. She looked up at Margaret with devastated eyes. Mom, what have I done? What have I let him do to us? Margaret couldn't maintain her distance anymore. She moved to Emma's side and pulled her daughter into her arms, feeling the familiar weight of the child she'd raised, now carrying a child of her own. You didn't let him do anything, Margaret said firmly. You were manipulated by someone who claimed to love you. That's not your fault. Emma cried against her mother's shoulder, and Margaret felt years of manufactured distance melting away. But underneath the relief of connection, she felt a growing fear about what would happen when David returned from his business trip. Would know immediately that something had changed. Would recognize that his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. And Margaret had no doubt that he would fight viciously to maintain the control he'd spent years establishing. What do I do now? Emma asked, her voice muffled against Margaret's shoulder. We figure it out together, Margaret said. But Emma, David isn't going to react well when he realizes you're questioning his version of events. We need to be very careful about how we handle this. Emma pulled back, wiping her eyes. What do you mean? Margaret thought about everything Lisa had taught her about psychological abuse, about the dangerous period when victims begin to recognize their situation. This was when abusers often escalated their control tactics, when the risk of emotional and sometimes physical violence increased. I mean that we need help. Professional help from people who understand these kinds of situations. Emma's hand moved to her belly again, this time with a different kind of protectiveness. Not protection from her mother, but protection for her unborn child from a situation she was finally beginning to understand. My baby, she whispered. What kind of father will he be if he could do this to you? To us? Margaret felt her heart breaking for her daughter's innocence lost, for the fairy tale marriage that was revealing itself to be a carefully constructed prison. We're going to figure this out, Margaret repeated, but we're going to do it carefully, with help from people who know how to handle these situations safely. As they sat together on the couch, Margaret realized that she was finally holding her daughter again, but the reunion was happening in the shadow of an even greater threat. David would be home tomorrow evening, and he would immediately sense that his control was slipping. The real battle for Emma's freedom was about to begin. David returned from his business trip Wednesday evening, his key turning in the lock at exactly 6:47 p.m., the time he'd texted Emma to expect him. Margaret had left hours earlier, but but not before helping Emma practice what she would say when David asked about her day. They'd agreed to keep the conversation simple. Emma had been feeling anxious about the birth plan and had called Lisa to talk through her concerns. It wasn't a lie, just an incomplete truth. But even that felt dangerous. Emma heard David's footsteps in the entryway, heard him setting down his briefcase and hanging up his coat with the precise movements that had once seemed admirably organized, but now felt obsessively controlled. She positioned herself on the living room couch, trying to appear casually absorbed in a pregnancy book, while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Emma, I'm home." David's voice carried its usual warmth, the tone of a devoted husband returning to his beloved wife. "In here," Emma called back, proud that her voice sounded normal. David appeared in the doorway, still wearing his business suit, his expression shifting from travel fatigue to immediate alertness as he studied Emma's face. She watched him scan her features with the intensity of someone reading a complicated document, looking for signs of what had happened in his absence. "How are you feeling?" he asked, crossing to kiss her forehead. "You look tired." "Just pregnancy stuff," Emma said, accepting his kiss while fighting the urge to pull away. "The baby's been active today." David's hand moved to her belly with practiced ease, his touch feeling different now that Emma was aware of how he monitored her every mood, every reaction. "Did you get some rest like I suggested?" "Yes. I also talked to Lisa this afternoon about some concerns I've been having." Emma watched David's face carefully, looking for signs of the reaction Margaret had warned her about. For a split second, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger exactly, but a sharp calculation that reminded Emma of how he looked during difficult client negotiations. "What kind of concerns?" His voice remained calm, interested, supportive. "Birth plan stuff. I've been feeling anxious about some of the decisions we made." David settled beside her on the couch, his body language open and concerned. But Emma noticed how he positioned himself so she couldn't easily get up, couldn't move away without asking him to shift. "Sweetheart, we've been through the birth plan dozens of times. Everything we decided was based on what would be safest and least stressful for you and the baby." His hand continued moving in circles over her belly. "What specifically is making you anxious?" Emma had practiced this conversation with Margaret, but facing David's direct questioning made her feel like she was walking through a minefield. "The visitor restrictions. I've been wondering if maybe we were too limiting." David's circling hand stilled. "Limiting how?" "Maybe my mom could be there. In the waiting room, at least. She's been through childbirth. She might be helpful." Support. The change in David was subtle, but immediate. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his breathing became more controlled, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of patient disappointment that Emma had heard many times before, but was only now recognizing as manipulation. "Emma, we talked about this extensively. You were very clear that having your mother there would add stress to an already overwhelming situation." David's voice carried the tone of someone reasoning with a confused child. "Remember how upset you got when we discussed it? How you said her emotional needs might overwhelm your own?" Emma tried to remember that conversation, but like so many of her memories from the past year, it felt vague and unreliable. Had she said those things? Or had David said them and convinced her she'd agreed? "I don't remember being upset about it," Emma said carefully. David's expression shifted to concerned confusion. "Sweetheart, you cried for an hour about feeling guilty for setting boundaries with your mother. I held you while you talked about how hard it was to prioritize your own needs over her emotional reactions." The description was so specific, so emotionally detailed, that Emma felt her newfound clarity wavering. Had that conversation happened? Was her memory of the afternoon with Margaret distorting her recollection of previous discussions with David? "Maybe I'm misremembering," Emma said uncertainly. "Pregnancy brain is real, honey. Dr. Williams told us that emotional volatility and memory issues are completely normal in the third trimester. David's voice was gentle, understanding, but Emma caught something else underneath: satisfaction. At her confusion, "David, did my mom really say the things you told me she said? About you not being good enough for me?" David's stillness became absolute. Emma could feel him thinking, calculating his response with the same strategic precision he brought to client presentations. "Emma, why are you asking about this now? Has someone been putting ideas in your head?" The question felt like a trap. Emma realized that David hadn't answered her question. He'd deflected it back to her, making her defensive instead of holding him accountable for his claims. "I just want to understand what actually happened." "What actually happened is that your mother has been struggling with your independence since our engagement. I've tried to shield you from the worst of it because I didn't want to damage your relationship with her." David's voice carried wounded nobility, the tone of someone making painful sacrifices for love. "But if you're questioning the boundaries we've set, maybe it's time you knew the full extent of her behavior." Emma felt a chill of recognition. This was exactly what Margaret had warned her about. David would escalate his lies when questioned, providing more detailed fabrications to shore up his crumbling narrative. "What do you mean, the full extent?" David stood up and walked to his briefcase, returning with his phone. "I didn't want to show you these, but your mother has been sending me texts for months. Accusatory, sometimes threatening messages about how I'm stealing you away from your family." He handed Emma the phone, and she scrolled through a series of text messages that made her stomach turn. The messages were from Margaret's number, but the tone was completely wrong. Angry, possessive, sometimes slurred as if written while drinking. "You're poisoning my daughter against me and I won't stand for it. Emma was fine before you came along. Now she's too good for her own mother. If you think you can replace me in her life, you're mistaken." Emma stared at the messages, feeling her reality shift again. The woman who had held her that afternoon, who had gently guided her to recognize David's manipulation, couldn't have written these venomous texts. "David, these don't sound like my mother." People can sound very different when they're drunk and angry. David's voice carried patient sadness. "Emma, I've been protecting you from this for months. Your mother has been spiraling since our engagement, and it's gotten worse during your pregnancy." Emma's mind raced. The messages looked real. They were from Margaret's number, time-stamped over several months. But the content was so completely inconsistent with everything Emma knew about her mother's character. "When did she send these?" David scrolled to a recent message dated yesterday, while Margaret had been visiting Emma. "This one came while I was traveling. She must have known I was out of town." The message read, "I know what you're doing to Emma, and I'm going to expose you." Emma felt the world tilting around her. Margaret had been at her house yesterday, talking about David's manipulation. If she had also sent this threatening text to David, it suggested a level of anger and vindictiveness that contradicted everything about their reconciliation. "I don't understand," Emma whispered. "I know it's confusing, sweetheart. This is why I didn't want you to have to deal with this stress during your pregnancy." David sat back down beside her, his voice full of compassionate concern. "Your mother is sick, Emma, emotionally sick, and she's trying to turn you against me because she can't accept that you've grown up and started your own family." Emma felt tears starting again, but this time they were tears of confusion and fear rather than relief. But yesterday she seemed so what? So normal. So much like the mother I remember. David's expression shifted slightly, and Emma caught a glimpse of something cold behind his eyes. "Emma, did your mother come here yesterday, while I was traveling?" The question was asked in the same gentle tone, but Emma sensed danger underneath it. She thought about Margaret's warnings about David's reaction when he realized his control was threatened. She She stopped by briefly to drop off some baby clothes from Janet. David was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed this information. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all warmth. "Emma, your mother violated the boundaries we set. She came here when she knew I wasn't home to protect you from her manipulation. And now you're questioning decisions we made together, doubting conversations you clearly remember having." The change in his tone was dramatic enough that Emma felt genuinely afraid for the first time in their relationship. This wasn't the loving, protective husband she'd married. This was someone else entirely. Someone cold and calculating and angry. "David, you're scaring me." "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to protect you and our baby from someone who is clearly unstable." David's voice was controlled, but Emma could see fury building behind his carefully maintained composure. "Emma, I need you to understand something. Your mother is going to try to convince you that I'm the problem, that I've been lying to you about her behavior. She's going to twist everything to make herself look like a victim and me look like a villain." Emma stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since their engagement. The mask of loving protection had slipped, revealing something manipulative and controlling underneath. "What if she's telling the truth?" Emma asked quietly. David's expression went completely cold. "Then you're choosing your unstable mother over your husband and the father of your child. Is that really the choice you want to make, Emma?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Emma realized that David was backing her into a corner, forcing her to choose between loyalty to him and belief in her own mother. It was the same pattern Margaret had described, isolating her from anyone who might help her see the truth. "I just want to understand what's real," Emma said. "What's real is that we're married. What's real is that we're about to have a baby together. What's real is that I've been protecting you from your mother's dysfunction for months, and now she's manipulating you into doubting the man who loves you most." David stood up and began pacing, his controlled facade continuing to crack. "What's also real is that if your mother continues to interfere in our marriage, I'll have no choice but to take legal action to protect my family." Legal action? Restraining orders, harassment charges, whatever it takes to keep her away from you and our child. David stopped pacing and looked directly at Emma. "Emma, you need to decide right now whether you trust your husband or your emotionally unstable mother. Because I won't continue to expose our family to her toxic behavior." Emma felt trapped between two versions of reality, each supported by evidence that seemed convincing. Her mother's gentle guidance and the relief of their reconnection felt real. But David's text messages and his detailed accounts of Margaret's behavior also felt real. The only thing Emma knew for certain was that the man standing in front of her, issuing ultimatums and threats, didn't look anything like the loving husband she thought she'd married. And that realization terrified her more than anything else. "I need time to think," Emma said quietly. David's expression hardened further. "Time to think? Or time for your mother to poison you against me further? Time to figure out what's true? The truth is that I love you and I'm trying to protect you. If you can't see that, then maybe your mother has already succeeded in destroying our marriage." David walked toward the bedroom, pausing at the doorway to deliver one final threat disguised as concern. "Emma, if you choose to believe your mother's lies over your husband's love, you're going to destroy our family before our child is even born. I hope that's not a decision you'll regret for the rest of your life." As David disappeared into the bedroom, Emma sat alone in the living room, feeling the full weight of her impossible situation. Her husband had just revealed himself to be someone capable of threats, manipulation, and cold calculation. But he'd also provided evidence that her mother might be equally unstable and vindictive. The baby moved restlessly in her belly, as if sensing her emotional turmoil. Emma placed both hands over her child, feeling more alone and confused than she'd ever felt in her life. Tomorrow, she would have to decide who to believe: and whatever choice she made would determine not just her own future, but the future of the child she was carrying. The battle for Emma's loyalty and her freedom had begun in earnest. Emma's contractions started at 2:17 a.m., 3 weeks before her due date. She woke to sharp pain radiating across her belly, her body instinctively recognizing that this was different from the Braxton Hicks contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. "David," she whispered, shaking her husband's shoulder. "I think it's time." David was instantly alert, switching into the efficient take-charge mode that had once seemed so reassuring. "How far apart are the contractions?" "I don't know. This is the first one that woke me up." David was already reaching for his phone, timing the intervals with mechanical precision. "We'll monitor them for an hour, then decide if we need to go to the hospital." But Emma's body had its own timeline. By 2:45, the contractions were coming every 4 minutes, intense enough that she couldn't talk through them. By 3 ayath, she was gripping the bathroom counter, overwhelmed by pain and a growing sense that something was wrong. "David, we need to go, now." The doctor said first babies take 12 to 20 hours of labor. "We have time." "Something's wrong," Emma gasped as another contraction peaked. "The pain is different. Please." David's jaw tightened with irritation, but he began gathering their hospital bags. As they drove through the empty streets toward Mercy General, Emma felt each contraction like a wave threatening to pull her under. But underneath the physical pain was something else, a clarity that had been missing for months. In crisis, David's true priorities were revealing themselves. He was focused on protocols, timelines, maintaining control of the situation. He wasn't focused on Emma's fear, her instinctive knowledge that her body was in distress. At the hospital, David immediately took charge of the admission process, answering questions directed to Emma and providing information from their carefully prepared birth plan. Emma found herself relegated to a secondary role in her own medical emergency, watching David manage her care like a project he was determined to complete successfully. "I need to call my mother," Emma said as a nurse helped her into a hospital gown. "That's not necessary yet," David replied smoothly. "Let's see how things progress first." "David, I want my mother here." "Emma, you're not thinking clearly right now. The stress of labor is affecting your judgment. We agreed that having your mother here would complicate things unnecessarily." Dr. Sarah Chen entered the room just as David finished speaking, her expression professional but alert. Emma had met Dr. Chen briefly during her recent appointment, had felt an immediate sense of trust in her competent, compassionate manner. "How are we doing, Emma?" Dr. Chen asked, directing the question specifically to Emma rather than David. "Scared," Emma admitted. "The contractions feel too intense, too fast." Dr. Chen nodded, beginning her examination. "Sometimes babies have their own timeline. Let's see what's happening." As Dr. Chen worked, Emma noticed how she included her in every step of the examination, explaining what she was checking and why. It was a sharp contrast to David's management style, which involved making decisions for Emma rather than with her. "Your cervix is already 6 centimeters dilated," Dr. Chen announced. "This baby is definitely coming today, probably within the next few hours." "Is that normal for a first pregnancy?" David asked. "Every pregnancy is different. Some first-time mothers have very efficient labors." Dr. Chen looked directly at Emma. "How are you feeling about pain management? Do you want to discuss an epidural?" Before Emma could answer, David spoke up. "We decided on natural childbirth. Emma wants to experience the full process without pharmaceutical intervention." Dr. Chen's expression didn't change, but Emma caught a subtle shift in her attention. "Emma, what are your thoughts about pain management?" Emma looked between David and Dr. Chen, recognizing a moment of choice. David's expression carried a clear message. She was expected to confirm their agreed-upon birth plan. But Dr. Chen's question had been directed to her, acknowledging her autonomy in making decisions about her own body. "I think I want the epidural," Emma said quietly. David's face tightened. Emma, we discussed this extensively. You said you wanted to avoid unnecessary medical interventions. Things change during labor, Dr. Chen said calmly. Emma, it's completely normal to adjust your birth plan based on how you're feeling in the moment. As Dr. Chen prepared to order the epidural, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, a medical professional was treating her as the primary decision-maker about her own body, rather than deferring to David's interpretation of her preferences. 20 minutes later, Margaret arrived in the waiting room, having driven through the night after receiving Lisa's text about Emma's labor. She looked exhausted and worried, clutching a small overnight bag and the baby blanket she'd been knitting for months. Lisa met her at the elevators. She asked for you, Lisa said simply. David tried to say it wasn't necessary, but Emma insisted. Margaret felt tears of relief and continued fear. How is she? Physically fine, but scared, and finally starting to see David clearly. They found Emma in early active labor, her face flushed with effort, but her eyes clear and determined. When she saw Margaret, she reached out her hand. Mom, thank you for coming. David stood on the other side of the bed, his expression carefully controlled, but his body language radiating tension. Margaret, I didn't expect to see you here. Emma asked me to come, Margaret replied, taking her daughter's hand. I know Emma's been confused lately, making decisions based on emotional impulses rather than careful planning. The stress of labor can affect judgment. Dr. Chen looked up from her monitoring equipment. Actually, many women find that labor provides unusual clarity about what support they need. Emma's been very clear about wanting her mother present. Margaret watched David's facade crack slightly as his authority was questioned by a medical professional. She could see him recalculating, trying to regain control of a situation that was slipping away from him. Dr. Chen, David said with forced politeness, I think you should know that Margaret has been dealing with some emotional instability lately. She's been making inappropriate contact with Emma, despite clear boundaries being set. Margaret felt her breath catch, knowing that David was trying to weaponize her professional troubles against her. But Dr. Chen's expression didn't change. Mr. Ross, my concern right now is Emma's medical care and emotional well-being during labor. She's indicated that having her mother present provides comfort and support. Emma squeezed Margaret's hand, as another contraction peaked. Mom, I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry I believed the lies. Don't apologize, Margaret whispered back. Just focus on bringing your daughter safely into the world. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of intensity and revelation. As Emma's labor progressed, David's true nature became impossible to hide. He questioned medical decisions, tried to override Emma's preferences, and repeatedly attempted to exclude Margaret from important moments. But Emma was finding her voice again. When David tried to insist that Margaret wait outside during the pushing phase, Emma refused. When he attempted to speak for her during medical consultations, she corrected him. When he suggested that the stress of having Margaret present was affecting her labor progress, Emma told him to stop. At 7:43 a.m., Sophia Rose Castellano Ross entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the delivery room with joy and relief. Margaret watched her daughter hold her newborn granddaughter, seeing Emma transformed by maternal love and fierce protectiveness. She's perfect, Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face as she studied her daughter's tiny features. David reached for the baby, but Emma instinctively turned away, holding Sophia closer to her chest. Not yet, she said firmly. Give me a few more minutes. Margaret saw the moment when Emma fully understood the threat David posed, not just to her, but to her child. The look that crossed her daughter's face was one of absolute maternal determination. Later, as Emma rested with Sophia sleeping on her chest, she looked at Margaret with clear eyes. I want to go home with you when we're discharged, she said, quietly. Sophia and I both? David, who had been texting someone in the corner of the room, looked up sharply. Emma, you're not thinking clearly. Postpartum hormones can cause confusion and poor decision-making. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months, Emma replied, and I'm choosing to prioritize my daughter's safety and my own well-being. Margaret felt her heart swell with pride and relief, but also fear for what Emma's choice would mean for all of them. David would not surrender control easily. We'll figure it out together, Margaret promised. All three of us. As Margaret looked at her daughter and granddaughter, she thought about the cost of the journey that had brought them to this moment. Her career was likely over, her professional reputation damaged. But Emma was free, Sophia was safe, and the truth had finally prevailed over manipulation. Some prices were worth paying, some fights were worth having, and some love was strong enough to survive even the most calculated attempts to destroy it. The distance between them had been manufactured, but the bond between mother and daughter, and now grandmother and grandchild, had proven unbreakable. They were finally home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.